70. Plagiostoma hoperi, tablet 26, figures 2, 3, 15. Transversely ovate, oblique, valves convex, covered with numerous diverging striae. Posterior slope short, anterior slope concave, elongated, obliquely striated, ears unequal, margin entire. This shell is nearly related to P. rigida and P. ovalis of Sowerby, Mineral Conchology, Volume 2, Tablet 114, from which it is distinguished by the inequality of the ears and the deep, elongated lunate of the anterior side. The general form of the shell is also somewhat dissimilar, and the striae are less distinct than in the fossils above mentioned. This species presents considerable variety both in its form and markings, but the differences observable are not sufficiently constant to require notice. It is more or less obliquely oval, but forms a larger segment of a circle than is strictly implied by that term. The length and width nearly correspond, and the thickness of the united valves equals about half the length. The striae, or rather sulci, are undulated and distinct in some examples, but in others are altogether wanting. The lunate, or depression on the anterior side, is very deep, and extends from the beaks to the commencement of the front. It is marked by numerous oblique striae, which are decussated by the lines of growth. The ears are plicated. That on the anterior side is small and obscure, but the other is distinct. The beaks are small and terminal. I have named this elegant shell in honor of the Reverend Henry Hooper, A.M. of Portslade, to whose kindness I am much indebted, than his modesty will permit me to acknowledge. Tablet 26, Figure 2. A specimen of the depressed variety with but few striae. Tablet 26, Figure 3, a shell in which the striae are distinct. Tablet 26, Figure 15. The united valves, the upper one rather displaced. This example exhibits the lunate on the anterior side. Localities, upper and lower chalk, near Lewis. 71. Diancora lata, Tablet 26, Figure 21. Semicircular, beak prominent, free valve plain. The obliquity of this species is scarcely observable, the lines of growth being slightly marked, and the gentle convexity of its form, added to the indistinctness of the few striae upon its surface, and the sharpness of its margin, give it a peculiar neatness. The specimen figured and described by Mr. Sowerby was found in the chalk near Lewis. I have not been so fortunate as to discover another example of the united valves. Tablet 26, Figure 21, represents the inner surface of a mutilated specimen of the lower valve. Locality, upper chalk, near Lewis. 72. Diancora obliqua, Tablet 25, Figure 1, Tablet 26, Figure 12. Obliquely obovate, upper valve convex, marked with numerous converging striae, Margin serrated. The free valve is convex and marked with upwards of 50 prominent striae, separated from each other by fine sulci and terminating in an acutely serrated margin. The beak is acuminated, the ears small and unequal. The lower valve, by which it is attached to other bodies, has its inferior surface finely granulated. Its sides are erect, wide at the anterior and posterior slopes, but very narrow in front. The posterior side is more elevated than the anterior, and the upper valve is in consequence inclined obliquely. This species is distinguished from D. lata by its ovate form and numerous striae, and from D. striata, the only other known species, by its obliquity, striated surface, and denticulated margin. Tablet 25, Figure 1, is a perfect specimen. It shows the triangular cavity beneath the beak, formed by the union of the valves, the smooth, erect border of the lower, and the striated surface of the upper valve. Tablet 26, Figure 12, the upper or convex valve, detached, collected by Colonel Birch. Localities: Upper Chalk, near Lewes and Brighton. '73. Austria something. Smith's Strata, Upper Chalk, figures 5, 6. The shells of the genus Austria are so irregular in form, and the same species in different stages of its growth exhibits such dissimilar appearances that it is very difficult to arrange them with precision. This consideration has induced me to relinquish the attempt to distinguish those that occur in Sussex by specific names. Since the specimens present no remarkable character, and although of various shapes and degrees of convexity, are probably only varieties of one species. The shells figured by Mr. Smith are of frequent occurrence in the Upper Chalk, near Lewes, and are commonly attached to other bodies. They appear to be the upper and under valves of the same species. They are nearly flat, of a suborbicular form, their margins very thin, and much expanded. 74. Austria something. Tablet 25, Figure 4. This shell is rather depressed, of an oblique ovate form, the external surface scabrous, the margin thin, and undulated by 5 or 6 depressions. The hinge is tripartite, marked with transverse plicae, and the adjoining edge of the shell on each side has a row of crenulated indentations. The inner border of the hinge is straight, and rendered very distinct by a deep hollow that extends beneath it. The inner surface is marked with a few gentle concentric ridges. The muscular impression is slight. 3 or 4 examples have been discovered with the characters above enumerated very distinctly marked, while others occur in which they are but obscurely expressed. It is not improbable that in a suite of specimens the present variety may pass insensibly into the flat oyster, previously noticed. Locality: Upper Chalk, near Lewes. 75. Teredo something. Tablet 18, Figure 23. The Teredo navalis, or shipworm, is well known for its depredations on the hulls of vessels, which in warm climates it sometimes completely destroys. The fossil, like the recent species, is found inhabiting cavities which it has formed in blocks of wood, and the wood, with the shells embedded, is frequently discovered in a petrified state in many parts of England. Portions of the tubular part of the shell are the only vestiges that occur in the Sussex chalk. These are sometimes enclosed in fragments of carbonized wood, but owing to the friable nature of the latter, are more commonly found detached. The specimens are of a depressed, cylindrical form, more or less bent and gradually tapering to a point. Their diameter at the larger extremity seldom exceeds half an inch, their length varying from 1 to 6 inches. The surface is smooth and has numerous indistinct angular elevations and depressions, like the recent teredo, of which in fact the present species appears to be only a variety. Tablet 18, figure 23, represents the usual appearance of these fossils. Localities: Upper Chalk, near Lewes and Brighton. '76. Terebratula subrotunda, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figures 1, 2. Circular, depressed, smooth, valves regular, equally convex, beak short. The width of this shell rather exceeds its length, which is seldom more than 0.7 inch. The sides, near the beak, are somewhat angular. The surface of the valves is smooth and marked by fine, transverse lines of growth. The lower or beaked valve has 2 hinge teeth, and the upper valve 2 corresponding grooves for their reception, from which 2 elongated appendages proceed. This structure is beautifully represented by Mr. Sowerby in figure 6, tablet 15. Localities: common in every part of the South Downs. 77. Terebratula ovata, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figure 3. Obovate, depressed, smooth, upper valve depressed. In this species the proportions are reversed, the length exceeding the width. It is nearly of the same size as the former. The beak is rather more produced. Localities: Upper and Lower Chalk, near Brighton and Lewes. 78. Terebratula undata, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figure 7. Obovate, both valves convex, smooth, front margin straight, with a deep undulation on each side, beak produced. The length of this species exceeds its width. It is distinguished from the 2 former by the straightness of the front and the deep undulations on each side. The beak is produced and its perforation large. Both valves are equally gibbous. It sometimes attains 1.5 inch in length. Localities: common in every quarry in the South Downs. The 3 species above described are easily distinguished from each other, but it must be confessed that the 2 following are so nearly related to the preceding, and in a suite of specimens pass so insensibly into each other, that the propriety of their separation may be questioned. I have, however, followed the arrangement of Mr. Sowerby, to avoid a multiplication of synonyms. 79. Terebratula intermedia, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figure 8. Obscurely 5-sided, rather depressed, smooth. Larger valve most convex, front margin undulated. 3 depressions in the smaller valve and 2 in the larger. The undulations in this species are not confined to the margin, but extend some distance along the body of the valves. The front is depressed. Localities: Upper and Lower Chalk, South Downs. 80. Terebratula semiglobosa, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figure 9. Nearly circular, gibbous, smooth. Larger valve deepest and uniformly gibbous. Front margin undulated, with 2 ridges on the lesser valve. The width of this shell nearly equals its length. Some specimens are very gibbous. The undulation in front, the two eminences on the upper valve, and the width and thickness of the united valves appear to be the distinguishing characters of the species. The shells of the terebratulae above described are invariably changed into crystallized carbonate of lime, their cavities, like those of the echinites, being frequently lined with calcareous spar, or crystals of sulphuret of iron. Their prevailing hue is a deep cream color, but sometimes shades of red, brown, and blue are observable. May not this in some measure depend on the color of the original? Localities: Upper and Lower Chalk, South Downs. '81. Terebratula plicatilis, Mineral Conchology, Tablet 118, Figure 1. Terebratula plicatilis, var. B. Octoplicata, Mineral Conchology, Tablet 118, Figure 2. Terebratula plicatilis, var. C. Consina, Mineral Conchology, Tablet 83, Figure 6. Gibbous transversely obovate, longitudinally striated, margin finely serrated, front sinuate, elevated with front sinuate, elevated with from 6 to 12 acute plessae, beak slightly projecting. The difference in the number of folds on the front is assumed by Mr. Sowerby as the specific distinction between his T. plicatilis and T. octoplicata. T. consina is separated on account of its more globose form. The specimens in my possession vary so much in the number of plessae, and in the convexity of the valves, and the characters of each are so intimately blended in many examples, that I have been compelled to consider them as only varieties of the same species. In var. A, the length of the shell exceeds the depth of the united valves, and the width is 1/3 greater than the length. The front margin is elevated by a broad sinus containing 12 plessae. Var. B has but 8 plessae. In var. C there are but 7 plessae. The valves are globose, the depth and width of the shell being nearly equal. The striae are rounded and diverge with a gentle sweep from the beaks to the margin, the number on each valve varying from 30 to 50. The lower valve is less convex than the upper. The beak is but slightly produced, and the perforation very small. The lateral margin is acutely serrated, and sometimes marked by several rows of plicated indentations, formed by the lines of growth. The elevated front margin and the numerous striae with which both valves are covered distinguish the present species from the other striated terebratulae of the chalk. Localities: Upper and Lower Chalk, near Brighton and Lewes. 82. Terebratula sublicata, Tablet 26, Figures 5, 6, 11. Transversely ovate, gibbous, nearly smooth, lower valve depressed, upper valve convex, margin serrated, front sinuate, with 3 or 4 sharp plessae, beak slightly produced. This is a small species, well characterized by its smooth surface and elevated, plicated front. The young of T. plicatilis, the only chalk terebratula with which it can be confounded, have both valves covered with minute striae. Like the other species of this genus, considerable variety is observable in the contour of the shell in different specimens. The plicae are from 3 to 5 in number and extend a short distance on both valves. The beak is very small. Locality: Upper Chalk, near Lewis. Inoceramus. This genus was formed by Mr. Sowerby for the reception of the fibrous bivalves, whose fragments occur in such prodigious quantities in almost every locality of the upper and lower chalk. These shells were first noticed by Da Costa, who describes them as being very large limpets which, like the conchylopus, resemble the single shell of a bivalve. They are of 2 kinds, and more irregular than that shell, and instead of being sulcated lengthwise, are circularly wrought in a transverse manner, with very high irregular ridges, not thickly but rather thinly set. The shells are very thick. One sort is high and copped, the other is broad and flattish. In the 3rd volume of Mr. Parkinson's Organic Remains, a fragment of an Inoceramus is accurately represented, Plate 5, Figure 3, and is noticed by that author as part of an uncommon fossil shell, resembling a patella in some of its characters. The celebrated geologists Monsieur M. Cuvier and Brongniart were induced from the striated crystalline structure of the shells in question to regard them as belonging to the genus Pina, but fragments of the hinge having been subsequently presented to their examination, they were led to doubt the correctness of their former opinion. For a knowledge of the structure of these curious shells, we are indebted to the acumen and zeal of Miss Bennet, of Norton House. From specimens in her cabinet, and with the assistance of others collected by the present writer, Mr. Sowerby has constructed the following generic definition. Inoceramus, a free, inequilateral beaked bivalve. Hinge linear, channeled, transversely sulcated, extending on one side of the beaks only, cartilage partly external. No visible muscular impression? The shells of this genus are more or less gibbous and are commonly marked with transverse concentric ridges and striae. Their constituent substance is invariably composed of crystallized carbonate of lime, of a radiated or fibrous structure. The hinge is a longitudinal furrow, transversely crenulated, extending on one side of the beaks only, its direction, as it regards the transverse diameter of the shell, being generally oblique. There are several species and many varieties, and in some specimens the characters are so much blended as to be distinguished with difficulty. The shell represented in Figure 1, Tablet 27, is an excellent type of the genus and is probably the most perfect specimen hitherto discovered. '83. Inoceramus cuvieri, Tablet 27, Figure 4. Tablet 28, Figures 1, 4. Convex with large, obtuse, distant, transverse costae, surface covered with numerous linear lamellae, hinge side depressed, expanded, posterior side flat, nearly smooth, beak small, reflexed, hinge oblique. The number of the costae varies from 8 to 12. They are large and rounded, and extend with a gentle sweep across the valves, being gradually lost in the expanded anterior side. The surface is covered with transverse lines and possesses a lamellated structure, appearing as if composed of a succession of thin plates. but the substance of the shell is perfectly solid and consists of fibrous calcareous spar. The posterior side is nearly flat and smooth. The hinge is placed obliquely. The comparative width and length of this species cannot be determined, since no perfect specimen has been discovered. The adult shell attains a gigantic size. A specimen in my possession must, when entire, have exceeded 3 feet in length and 20 inches in width. Fragments of the hinge of a corresponding magnitude are not uncommon, some of them being more than 1.5 inch wide and 1.2 inches thick. This species is named in honor of the illustrious Cuvier, to whose researches the comparative anatomist and the geologist are so greatly indebted. Tablet 27, Figure 4, fragment of the hinge, exhibiting the transverse crenulated sulci. Tablet 28, Figure 1, a specimen the interior of which is filled with flint. Tablet 28, Figure 4, represents the upper and lower valve of the same individual embedded in a block of chalk. The hinge groove is placed beneath the oblique line on the left side of the uppermost valve. Localities: common in the upper chalk, near Lewis, Eastbourne, etc. 84. Inoceramius lamarcki. Tablet 27, Figure 1. Valves equal, very convex, with a few obscure longitudinal undulations, and distant transverse ridges, surface covered with numerous concentric striae. Posterior slope subdepressed, anterior side lobate expanded, hinge nearly transverse. Both valves are equally convex and gradually expand towards the margin, the greatest convexity being near the middle of the shell, which is suddenly contracted longitudinally and has a lobated appearance on the hinge side. The beaks are incurved and inclined toward the posterior slope, which is slightly concave. The anterior side is convex, expanded, and separated from the body of the valve by a deep furrow or depression. The hinge is nearly transverse. The whole surface is marked with fine transverse striae, disposed concentrically on the convex part and expanding over the anterior side with an elegant sweep, terminate on the hinge line. The ridges are distant and vary in strength and number, but seldom exceed 6 or 8 on each valve. The longitudinal depressions mentioned by Mr. Parkinson as affording a specific distinction are obscure in many instances, and altogether wanting in others. The specimens are from 3 to 4 inches long and 2.5 inches wide. The greatest convexity of the united valves is 3.5 inches. Mr. Parkinson, as a tribute of gratitude for the advantages afforded to science by the classification of Lamarck, has affixed his name to the present species. Localities: Upper Chalk, near Lewis, and Brighton. 85. Inoceramius brongniarti. Tablet 27, Figure 8. Equivalved, gibbous, transversely costated, anterior side angular, acute, posterior side flat, truncated, hinge transverse, straight. The shell is very gibbous, the convexity of the united valves being equal to its length. The valves are regular and gradually increase in width from the hinge to the front. There are about 20 prominent ridges or costae on each, with which diverge from the posterior slope over the convexity of the shell and terminate with a gentle curve on the border of the hinge. The posterior side is flat, the anterior acute, forming an angle with the hinge. The latter is transverse, its plane corresponding with the transverse diameter of the valves. The front is rounded, the margin very entire, the beaks small and reflexed. The present species may be distinguished from the preceding by the number and strength of the costae, the flat, truncated posterior slope, and more particularly by the hinge side, which is not expanded as in Inoceramis's Lamarcki. I have named this elegant shell in honor of my friend Monsieur Brongniart, the able colleague of Baron Cuvier, author of Géographie minéralogique des environs de Paris, etc. Tablet 27, Figure 8, an excellent specimen in which the characters of the species are well defined. The beaks are broken off. This figure is reduced to 1/2 the size of the original. Tablet 28, Figure 3, an imperfect example of a variety of this species. Localities: Upper Chalk, near Lewes and Brighton. 86. Inoceramis's Mytilloides. Tablet 28, Figure 2. Depressed, elongated, with numerous concentric striae, and a few distant ridges, posterior slope inflated, its margin plicated, anterior side depressed, expanded, beaks acuminated, hinge very oblique. The shell is most convex near the beaks, and gradually becomes flatter and more expanded towards the margin. The beaks are produced, and terminate in a sharp point, over the commencement of the hinge. The plane of the latter is placed at an acute angle with the longitudinal diameter of the valve. The striae are numerous, and form a few irregular ridges that terminate in folds on the margin of the posterior slope. Fragments of this species are not uncommon in the lower chalk of Sussex, but I have not seen a perfect specimen. Tablet 28, Figure 2, a specimen from Plumpton. The shell represented in Tablet 27, Figure 3, has the acuminated beaks and oblique hinge of the present species, but the ribs are more prominent and numerous, and the valves more convex. It may perhaps hereafter prove to be specifically distinct. Localities: Plumpton, Offham, Sotherham. 87. Inoceramis's latus. Tablet 27, Figure 10. Valves convex near the beaks, flat and expanded towards the front, surface marked with distant transverse ridges and numerous concentric striae. Posterior slope smooth, depressed, anterior side expanded, hinge oblique. This species equals Inoceramus quiveri in length and width, but is much depressed and is also destitute of the prominent costae by which that species is distinguished. Fragments occur that are from 18 to 20 inches wide and almost flat. The posterior side is smooth and depressed, the anterior expanded. When this part is broken off, the valves assume a triangular form, as in the example figured. The hinge is very oblique. Tablet 27, Figure 10, exhibits the usual appearance of the specimens. The figure is diminished 3/4. Localities common in the Upper Chalk near Brighton, Lewes, Offham, etc. 88. Inoceramus websteri. Tablet 27, Figure 2. Convex, smooth, with distant, irregular, transverse ridges, beaks rounded, posterior slope nearly flat, anterior side expanded, hinge very oblique. The valves are convex, the surface smooth, and the ridges placed at unequal distances. The greatest convexity is near the beaks, from whence the shell gradually becomes flatter and expands as it approaches the front. The posterior slope is small and somewhat depressed, the hinge side flat and broad. This species differs from Inoceramus brongniarti in the ridges being distant and irregular, and from the young of Inoceramus lamarcki, in the greatest convexity being near the beaks and not in the center of the valves, as in that species. It is a small shell, seldom exceeding the size of the figure, and is named in commemoration of the interesting researches of Thomas Webster, Esquire, keeper of the Museum of the Geological Society, whose unassuming manners and extensive information have obtained him the respect and esteem of all who have the pleasure of his acquaintance. Locality, Lower Chalk, South Street, very rare. 89. Inoceramus striatus. Tablet 27, Figure 5. Gibbous, rounded, even, with numerous transverse striae. Hinge oblique, beaks. The roundness of this shell and its finely striated surface readily distinguish it. The specimen figured has a ridge down the convex part of the valve, but as this appearance is not constant, it is omitted in the specific description. A perfect example has not been discovered. Locality, Lower Chalk, South Street, very rare. It occurs also in the chalk near Heytesbury, Wilts. 90. Inoceramus undulatus. Tablet 27, Figure 6. Convex, marked with numerous regular transverse elevations and depressions, posterior slope truncated, hinge side expanded. The surface being gently undulated by the round, even, alternate elevations and depressions, this shell has a peculiarly neat appearance. The posterior slope is flat and nearly smooth. The valves are regularly convex, but hollowed or contracted on the anterior side, which is expanded. The beaks are rounded and incurved. Locality, Upper Chalk, near Lewes. 91. Inoceramus something. Tablet 27, Figure 9. This shell is rather depressed near the beaks and inflected in front. It has numerous concentric ridges and striae. It is in too mutilated a state to admit of a more particular description. Locality, Lower Chalk, Lewes. Fragments of other species of Inoceramus occur in the chalk in the vicinity of Lewes, but the specimens hitherto collected are not sufficiently perfect to warrant their specification. 92. Parasitical bodies in the shells of various species of Inoceramus. Tablet 27, Figure 7. The shells of the larger Inocerami appear to have been subject to the ravages of a peculiar parasitical animal, which destroyed the intermediate substance, leaving the outer and inner plates entire and supported only by thin partitions. The specimens exhibiting these appearances are full of small oblong cells connected by linear perforations, and these are either empty or filled with chalk or flint. In the latter case, they give rise to a curious class of fossils, the nature of which has but very lately been explained. A specimen of this kind is represented Tablet 27, Figure 7. It is part of a flint, molded in the interior of an Inoceramus, containing on its surface numerous irregular oblong bodies, more or less compressed, and united to each other by slender lateral filaments. These curious bodies were first noticed by Mr. Parkinson, and have subsequently formed the subject of an interesting memoir from the pen of the Reverend W. Conybeare, published in the second volume of the Geological Transactions. The investigations of Mr. Conybeare have clearly elucidated the origin of the fossils in question, and shown that they are siliceous casts, formed in little cells, excavated in the substance of certain marine shells, the work of animalculae preying on those shells and on the vermes inhabiting them. These casts, like the screwstones of Derbyshire, must have been formed by the infiltration of siliceous matter while in a fluid state into the cavities of the shells, and which have been laid open and denuded by subsequent exposure to some agent, capable of dissolving and removing the calcareous matter of the shell, forming the matrix, while the siliceous cast remained unaltered. Upon this subject, Professor Buckland remarks that the hollows affording a mold for the formation of these bodies are clearly the work of some minute parasitical insect. The small aperture, the cast of which now forms the projecting axis of each globule, was probably perforated by this intruder as the entrance to his future habitation. Having completed this passage and excavated at its termination a cell suited to his shape and convenience, he appears by the aid of a delicate auger or proboscis to have drilled many minute and almost capillary perforations into the substance of the shell on every side around him, taking care to leave always partitions sufficient to support the thin external plate of the shell which formed the roof of his apartment. Having exhausted all the nourishment that could be procured in this manner with safety from the vicinity of his first establishment, the insect appears to have emigrated, and after working for itself a lateral passage to a considerable distance, to have formed a new settlement in the midst of fresh supplies. In a recent oyster shell in my possession, this process has been carried on to a great extent in the intermediate matter between 2 or 3 sets of the pearly plates comprising it, and yet without affecting the destruction of the exterior crust, or in any degree injuring the inner surface of the shell, which remains untouched, and notwithstanding these attacks, still equally adapted to every purpose required by the economy of its inhabitant. Siliceous specimens of this fossil are not frequent in Sussex, but there are scarcely any of the larger Inocerami that do not exhibit traces of the depredation of this parasite, the cells being either empty or filled with chalk. The example figured in Tablet 27 was found on the beach at Brighton. The shell is entirely removed. 93. Balanus, Tablet 33, Figure 11. The specimen figured is the only vestige of a multivalve shell that has been noticed in the chalk of Sussex. It is gently curved, has 2 sharp ridges, and not inaptly resembles the beak of a bird. It is the valve of an operculum of some unknown species of Balanus. Locality, Upper Chalk, near Lewes. Crustacea. The fossil remains of those species of cancer in which the crustaceous covering is hard and compact are not unfrequent in the London clay at Highgate, Sheppey, etc., and a few have already been noticed as occurring in the blue chalk marl of Sussex. But the lobster, crayfish, and other species, whose structure is more delicate and fragile, are but seldom found in a mineralized state, and rank among the most rare and interesting objects in the cabinet of the eryctologist. About 7 years since, the remains of an unknown crustaceous animal were discovered in the upper chalk near Lewes, but the mutilated and brittle state of the specimens defied all my attempts to ascertain their original form. In the hope, however, that from detached portions of the animal the required information might ultimately be obtained, every fragment that could be procured was carefully examined and preserved, and the result has ultimately exceeded my most sanguine expectations, since not only the generic, but also the specific characters of the original have been determined. The remains in question are composed of a delicate friable crust, and when first collected are of a dark chocolate color, inclining to black, but become pale and lose much of their beauty by exposure to the air. The inner surface only is seen in those specimens that are exposed by fracture. It is glossy and covered with minute circular depressions, formed by the bases of the spines. The external surface is armed with short spines and papillae, and is invariably concealed by the chalk, until the latter be carefully removed by art, a process which, from the delicacy of the fossil and the hardness of the surrounding matrix, is exceedingly difficult and tedious, and can scarcely be accomplished by an inexperienced hand. Of the specimens in my collection, some contain the claws, others the thorax, and a few exhibit the abdomen and tail. These detached parts having been accurately delineated, a restored outline of the original was formed, and by a careful comparison of the latter with the recent crustacea, the genus and species of the original have been ascertained. 94. Asticus leachi, Tablet 29, figures 1, 4, 5. Tablet 30, figures 1, 2. Tablet 31. General characteristics. Antennae pedunculated, unequal, the exterior ones long and setaceous, inner pair divided at the extremity, body elongated, legs commonly 10, tail foliaceous. Specific characteristics. Thorax scabrous, convex, 6-lobed, marginate, head semicircular in front, hands cellate, muricated, twice the length of the thorax, pincers very long, armed with obtuse spines. The thorax is longitudinally oblong, convex, covered with small tubercles and papillae. It is divided into 6 lobes by a rounded dorsal ridge and 2 lateral sulci. The margin is entire. The form of the head of this species is unknown. It appears to have been semicircular or rounded in front, and is not distinct from the thorax. The external antennae are long, filiform, and setaceous, and are placed on squamous pedicles. The inner pair have not been discovered. The 2 cellate hand claws are equal, and have their surface muricated, or beset with short erect spines. The pincers are very long, not muricated, but marked with 3 or 4 longitudinal punctated furrows. Each finger is armed with a row of obtuse cylindrical spines, which are mutually received and inserted when the claws are shut. The claws, including the pincers, are equal to twice the length of the thorax. There are 5 legs on each side. The anterior pair is didactyl. The others appear to terminate in swimmers or paddles, but this circumstance cannot be accurately determined. The abdomen is composed of 6 granulated arcuate segments. The tail is foliaceous, marginate, granulated, and has a few longitudinal ridges, but the only known specimen, Tablet 30, Figure 1, does not exhibit the entire form. This species appears to be distinguished from the recent animals of the genus by the dorsal ridge and lateral sulci of the thorax, the great length and straightness of the pincers, and the peculiar form of their spinous processes. In naming this fossil in honor of William Elford Leach, M.D. of the British Museum, I am desirous of testifying the high respect which I entertain for his talents as a naturalist, and particularly for his excellent systematical arrangement of the crustaceous animals. Tablet 29, figures 1, 4, 5, the chelate claws of A. leachi. Tablet 29, figure 4, is the largest example hitherto discovered. Tablet 29, figure 1, a fragment of the pincers of the preceding specimens. Tablet 29, figure 5, a block of chalk containing part of a claw, leg, and several detached spines. Fragments of a fish are attached to the upper part of this specimen. Tablet 30, figure 2, two chelate hand claws attached to the chalk in which they were embedded. Tablet 31, figure 1. On the left of this specimen, part of the thorax is attached, and on the right, a hand claw deprived of one of its pincers. Tablet 31, figure 2. Cast of the thorax, the head broken off. Tablet 31, figure 3. The thorax flattened by compression. Tablet 31, figure 4, represents the most perfect specimen in my collection. A. The head. B. The thorax. C. One of the long cetaceous antennae. D. The squamous pedicle of the same. E. One of the anterior legs with its didactylous termination. F. The hand claws and pincers. Tablet 34, figure 9. Part of a claw flattened by compression. Localities: Upper Chalk, near Lewis, and Houghton. '95. Asticus something. Tablet 30, figure 3. This specimen is evidently the chelate hand claw of a species of Asticus, distinct from the preceding. The surface both of the claws and pincers is spinous, the latter are slightly curved, and armed with a row of obtuse tubercles. Locality: Upper Chalk, near Lewis. '96. Cancer. Tablet 29, figure 3. This figure represents the chelate hand claw of a species of cancer, having a minutely granulated surface. The pincers are curved and finely serrated on the inner edge. Locality: Upper Chalk, near Lewis. 97. Cancer. Tablet 29, Figure 2. The cast of the thorax of a species of cancer is represented in the figure referred to. It is of an obchordate form, much depressed, the margin impressed with 4 or 5 indentations, and the front cleft in the middle. Locality: Upper Chalk, near Lewis. 98. Leg of an unknown crustaceous animal. Tablet 34, Figure 4. This fossil is part of the leg of some crustaceous animal, but whether belonging to either of the genera above mentioned cannot be ascertained. It is nearly black, and its surface highly polished. Locality: Offham Chalk Pit, near Lewis.